Thank you. You know, that is a lot of good ideas all before 10 a.m., but it doesn't stop there. We've got more coming right now. My name is Eli Dvorkin. I am the editorial and policy director at the Center for an Urban Future, and it's my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. We have limited time, so I will just briefly introduce our panelists, and then we will get right into the conversation. So we are joined today by, among others, Gregg Bishop. Gregg is the executive director of the Social Justice Fund, an initiative funded by the Joe and Clara Tsai Foundation, focused on racial justice and economic mobility. Gregg previously served as the commissioner of the Department of Small Business Services, where he launched new programs to strengthen small business and expand access to good jobs through career training. Welcome, Gregg.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined today by Winston Fisher. Winston is partner of Fisher Brothers and CEO at Area 15. He serves as co-chair of the Regional Economic Development Council in New York City, and he launched the Middle Class Jobs Project in partnership with the Center for an Urban Future. Welcome, Winston. We're also joined today by Lizette Nieves. Lizette is the president of the Fund for the City of New York, an institution focused on advancing the functioning of government and nonprofits in New York City and beyond. She's really one of the city's leading thinkers focused on the intersection of higher education and economic mobility, and we're so glad to have you with us today. Welcome, Lizette.
Thank you.
We're also joined today by Seth Pinsky. Seth is CEO of the 92nd Street Y, one of New York City's leading nonprofit cultural and community centers. Seth previously served as president of the city's Economic Development Corporation for 5 years under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, where he helped lead the city's economic rebound from the Great Recession. Hey, Seth. We're also joined today by David Rockwell. David is the founder and president of Rockwell Group, an award-winning cross-disciplinary architecture and design practice based right here in New York. You've seen his work from the stages of Broadway to outdoor dining on the streets of New York City, and I'm really excited to hear his thoughts today. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we're joined today by Sheena Wright. Sheena is the president and CEO of United Way of New York City, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping low-income New Yorkers make ends meet and lead self-sufficient lives. Sheena has advised many of the city and state's top elected officials on issues around education, equity, and economic inclusion, and we are so thrilled to have you with us today. Welcome, Sheena.
Thank you.
And as this is a cut forum, for those of you who may be a little rusty, it's been about 19 months, but there will be no opening statements. We will just get right into the discussion. So feel free, all of you, jump in, share your thoughts. We'd love to make this a conversation and not just a down the line. But let me start today with the most immediate and pressing challenge, reviving the city's stressed and battered economy. Today, New York City is home to nearly 500,000 fewer jobs than before the pandemic hit. But this toll has been strikingly uneven. Employment in the hospitality sector is still 35% below the pre-pandemic level. Personal care, including nail salons and barbershops, is down 20%. Retail trade is down 14%. And these are all sectors that are home to a large number of accessible jobs. By comparison, employment in tech and advertising has nearly returned to where it was in February of 2020. So this question is really a jump ball for anyone who wants it. What should the city's incoming leaders prioritize first when it comes to bringing back more of these jobs that have been lost and sparking new ones where it's possible? What would your top priority be for ensuring that the city's economy does come back strong, period? I was using your incredible height. You've been able to capture the ball, tip it to your team.
I mean, it's the areas that you've talked about are obviously challenged, right? There's things that are beyond New York, right? If you want tourism to come back, actually Biden announcing that people can come, international travelers can now come back here if they're vaccinated, is very helpful for New York. I think that overall New York has public safety, which we've talked about. That is something that's critical to get people back. Much of those sectors, when you talk about retail, small business, it's the office sector. I can tell you, Fisher Brothers never cracked, at the height of the crisis, we never got above 10% physical occupancy. We just got back to about 25% physical occupancy in our buildings. That is indicative of every building in Midtown and probably lower Manhattan. You've got to get office workers back. You have to make public transportation, people have to believe it's safe. And I think they've done a good job, but they do have to believe that it's safe, secure. I think we're gonna have a traffic crisis coming up, so we really need to be thinking about, because New York has a perception problem today, that it's a tough place to do business. It's dense, which makes it feel unsafe. So you have to address that head on. And then there's areas, the creative economy. It is a massive, massive opportunity for New York. And it's not just Broadway, it's not just film, it's the gig economy of independent artists. I think that's a huge growth sector.
Let me jump in there because I think, my experience is that the pandemic exposed issues that were pre-existing in New York, particularly around artists and working people being priced out of the city, and vast amounts of unused space. And I think the pandemic gave us the opportunity, like many crises, forced an accelerated look at how do we define New York's public space? Not just the big parks, but how do we share the street? What's the premium on that space? And I think, as Winston says, how do, someone else mentioned Jane Jacobs, but the Jane Jacobs ballet of everyday life, where you're not coming just for work. And in fact, you may not be coming to work, but there's a number of different things. I want to point to, we worked with the Fund for the City of New York on a program for outdoor dining early on, and actually lobbying the city and trying to find a scenario where restaurants could share space with communities and with the sidewalk. And one of the things I was inspired by is how much change can happen when there's an identified need and everyone's focused on making those decisions. So I think moving into the kinds of changes that the city needs, for instance, Winston mentioned the creative class. There's a huge need for rehearsal space in the city. Much like the supply chain, there's no materials, there is no rehearsal space, and there's vast amounts of empty spaces, probably some of them in your buildings. And if there could be a subsidized, almost Airbnb-like way to aggregate spaces, not just street front spaces, but offer those to artists and artist groups, I think it starts to just be one of many things that takes advantage of the public's focus on livability, on equity, on energizing our spaces so the cities remain vital.
Could I? Oh, you go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this. I think that something's really unique, particularly about this. First of all, the inequalities we knew existed before this, so that part's not unique, right? As you said, it just laid them bare. But what is unique is that it's particularly the hardest hit are women of color, right? And primarily women who are raising children. And so we can't ignore that from the last recession that you had worked on that was focused on men. This one has to be focused on women. So there has to be a gender lens on this, but there also has to be a family recognition lens on this. So for example, childcare. We don't have a childcare infrastructure the way that we need. We want to get people back, right? We're not. And I think the other thing that we have to recognize is that we have a whole group of what would be first-generation college students that are not matriculating, have chosen not to go that option, which means further distance from well-paying jobs. So there has to be attentions on targeted demographics in a way than just industries that I think are important.
I was going to say that I agree with that, and we have to make sure that whatever growth eventually occurs is more equitable, but we also have to make sure that there's growth. And I think that the key to solving all of our problems is having resources. And the way that we have resources is by having an economy that is expanding. And I think looking back, what we did very right as a city over the last 10 or 15 years was figuring out the formula for making the economy successful. What we did less right, and I think what the pandemic has exposed, is figuring out how to take the benefits of that success and spread them more evenly. But I still think that the necessary prerequisite to all of this is that initial prosperity. And I think the formula that was working for us pre-pandemic is still the formula that will work for us going forward, which is that our greatest natural resource, what oil is to Saudi Arabia, talent is to us. And our workforce and the diversity of that workforce and the skills of that workforce, that's what causes everything else to work. And that's kind of the fuel that powers the economic engine of New York. And the key to attracting talent is making sure that all of the disadvantages that all of us know exist when you live in New York are outweighed by the advantages. And one of the real problems that we have today in New York, and one of the things that concerns me, is that not only have many of the negatives of living in New York gotten worse, I think quality of life has declined, crime has increased, or certainly the perception of crime has increased, sanitation is down, and in addition to that, many of the things that made living in New York worthwhile, the positives of being here, because of the pandemic, are less positive. There's less arts and culture, there's less entertainment, fewer restaurants. And so I think that in order for us to succeed as a city, in order for us to generate the resources that we need to make sure that we have equitable growth, which we do need to have, the key is for us to restore quality of life, to prioritize all of the things that attract talent. And once again, then we can start that virtuous cycle where talent attracts businesses, businesses attract talent, and so on and so forth.
They become overwhelming, though, sometimes.
Well, let me go to Sheena, and then
Yeah.
we'll come back to Dave. Thank you.
That'd be great. Just in terms of that talent, and I think that's absolutely right, and that's why businesses want to come to New York City. But we often think of attracting talent from somewhere else, and the focus of this next recovery has to be building and growing the talent we have. We have many, communities where we're not taking a very focused and intentional look and ensuring that the workforce development opportunities and talent development is directly tied to the economic development opportunities and the projects and the different industries. And that's got to be intentional going forward and really in a meaningful and measurable way. So building and growing the talent that we have so that we're not leaving anyone behind. And then that talent also spurs new industry, new business, entrepreneurship, and growth as well.
I think you're gonna recognize a theme here that we're all saying. It's really education and entrepreneurship. And the next administration has to really double down on the education side. I totally agree with you. We have, for whatever reason, and I grew up in New York City, and I grew up in New York City in the 80s, so I remember the old New York City. And vocational school, vocational, that word became sort of like a dirty word. But we really have to invest in our young people, in our high schools. And industry, to your point, Seth, has to be part of that equation, which means government needs to be friendly to industry, right? Government cannot be anti-industry, which I think we've seen in the past of sort of like big business, we don't want to talk to you. But there needs to be sort of that collaboration because we can't do it alone. And when I say we, meaning government can't do it alone.
And
Certainly.
industry has to be friendly
Yes.
to talent that's pre-existing
And
here.
that goes,
Sorry.
and that goes to the sort of apprenticeship model where you have young people who are working in industry to expose them to basically, whatever that sector that they want to go into. And it doesn't mean we don't want them to go to college. It just means that they have a choice. And second is entrepreneurship. And I love the idea of using unused space. My old agency, Small Business Services, and I'm going to throw it out there while I have the time. Our budget is $100 million. That's nothing. And that agency is responsible for entrepreneurship and workforce. So that agency needs the resources where they can maybe think about this. If you have, because we did an analysis of over 1,500 Black entrepreneurs before I left. And one of the biggest things outside of access to capital is affordable space. So if the city comes up with an innovative way to get all these empty storefronts and turn them into incubators where entrepreneurs, and we don't want to waste, and I know this pandemic has been very traumatic, but this crisis presents an opportunity for us as a city to show that we want to encourage entrepreneurship and we want to be more business friendly.
Thanks, Greg. Let me go to Winston. Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree 100% about homegrown talent, working with industry, working with education. Actually, at Fisher Brothers, we just started a program with BASTA to work with CUNY kids, first generation, coming out of high performance, who are CUNY, so it's not Harvard, it's not Yale, it's these kids, and they're getting an internship at Fisher Brothers so they can actually get on their resume a reputable, a firm that will help them break through the barrier. What we need to be very clear is it's hard to find that. We really struggled as a company to figure out how to actually work with first generation, with CUNY. So it's not that business doesn't want to do it, it's actually not easy to do. We are not capable of finding kids. That's not actually what a firm our size would never be able to do it. So actually having easy to navigate programs for small, medium, and large sized businesses to access homegrown talent is critical, and that part is missing, and there's a lot of people trying. So I think that is something that will be a big part of this recovery. I will also just put in, it has to be public-private. There is no government solution to this problem, and industry is scared of New York today. It is almost oppressive, the level of regulation to operate in this city versus we do business in Nashville, Las Vegas, in Florida. It's so easy. It is so hard to work in New York. And it's New York. There's an attraction to talent. But if we want to grow our way out of this, and that is the only way out of this crisis, we have to make it easier for public and private to work together and grow together.
Thanks, Mr. Let me go back to David. I've got another question for all of you.
So, I just want to point out the city's capable of enormous change. Like if you look at the history of the city, parks till the mid-19th century as a group wasn't an organized force. There's huge change that can happen, kind of piece at a time. And I look at Wellington, Chan, who when we were talking to the city about community dining, what made that happen was someone who knew everyone in the community. We were able to match that to a funding source, because you talk about funding on a smaller scale, there's lots of funders who want to create great works of private-public partnership. And that transformed a neighborhood because someone was willing to kind of organize that. And I think that notion of going in to understand what that community wants and not looking at them as overwhelmingly large projects, but being able to take a start piece by piece does allow for a great amount of change. But I think it is a moment in which it's so complicated to make any change. Just, I think a piece at a time has more impact than people realize.
Thanks, David. And I just wanted to say we'll go right back to this conversation about how to ensure that this recovery is inclusive and equitable. But I do want to kind of stay on this point about how to ensure that we have a strong economic recovery in the first place. I think, Seth, you brought this up at the beginning, so I'll throw this one back to you. I'm curious, already we've touched on a little bit about how this is a unique crisis. It's not like the Great Recession. I think Lizette said it very well. That was a crisis that disproportionately affected jobs that men are likely to hold. This one is very different. This is affecting women more. We're certainly seeing that this has been a recovery that has not been equitable, but I think part of that is looking at the actual impacts on which jobs were lost and which industries were hit the hardest. So I'm curious, this is maybe we'll start with Seth, but I'd turn this open to everybody. What are one or two very specific things that you think that the incoming administration could do, either building on what you've experienced, running EDC, or maybe things that are different than our approach before? And you mentioned that the formula may be the same, that there's things that we're already working that we should be doing. And I think a couple of you have also, and David, you just mentioned this, talking about not just tackling this huge problem as a kind of an intractable, knot, but breaking it up into smaller pieces. And Seth, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned the power of pilot programs to start without having too many barriers about which is the right one or where do we begin, but to say there's actually a lot of things that we could be doing. So I'm curious, what are some of those things? Where would you put some resources right now?
Yeah, I want to come back to something that a word that's been used by a couple of people, which is entrepreneurship, which I really think is an area that we should be focusing on for a variety of reasons. One is that the world has changed around us, and I'm not sure any of us understand exactly how it's changed. And so for us to say that we should target the industries that have worked here in the past, or give people certain skills that were important in the past, that automatically is going to lead to success going forward, I don't think we can say that with certainty. And the best way to ensure that we are building businesses that are competitive in the new economy is to put the tools in the hands of what I said before is our greatest resource, which is our workforce, and allow them to start what they think are the right companies, and then let the market sort out which companies are going to be successful in the new economy and which are not. So that's reason number one. I think reason number two is that we want to tie people and businesses back to New York. And I think what you've seen historically is that businesses that start in New York, where the founders are from New York and live in New York, are more likely to stay and grow in New York. And so I think that's another reason why entrepreneurship is important. And then the third comes to your point about equity, which is that the best way to create wealth, the best way to ensure that the value that's created by work stays in a community is to have ownership of that business in the community. And so when we think about entrepreneurship, I think there are a couple of different types of entrepreneurship that we should focus on. One is kind of that export-oriented entrepreneurship that's sexy and discussed a lot in the news, startup businesses, technology, what have you. But then there's a second type of business that we should also be equally focused on that requires a different set of resources and a different approach, and those are local service businesses, local stores, businesses that produce services and goods for the local community. And that is important, both because it serves the other ends that I was describing, but also because you can build those kinds of businesses in every community across the city, and every community can benefit from the creation of those businesses. And we can have a longer conversation about how exactly you do that, but I think that is probably the greatest tool that we have to harness the entrepreneurial spirit and the entrepreneurial energy that exists in the city. And by the way, I'll just add one other thing to Winston's point. In order for any of this to work, we can't make the regulatory environment oppressive. And that's not to say that we should entirely deregulate or that businesses shouldn't be subject to any rules. That's not it at all. But anyone who's run a business in New York and has tried to navigate through the red tape that we have knows that our regulatory regime here is completely irrational. And to rationalize that, to make it so that it, on the one hand, protects the public, but on the other hand, allows business to grow and thrive, that's another key ingredient.
Well, Greg, I see you nodding your head here. I mean, let me just set this up a little bit to say, because I think there's a lot of pieces to this. But first of all, let me just say, before the pandemic, I think one of New York City's greatest strengths were its minority-owned small businesses. I mean, we had over 64,000 businesses, minority-owned small businesses, with employees in New York City. That's more than all of the businesses in Dallas, in Philadelphia, in a number of other major U.S. cities. But this past 18 months have been brutal, and we've seen the disproportionate impact there. Frankly, we know that before the pandemic, not only were those businesses more vulnerable to a financial shock, we know that they were earning far less revenues than comparable businesses in the same industries that were white-owned. Now, you've done a lot to help start to address some of these things, but 10 years ago, employer-owned, black-owned employer businesses were about 2% of all the businesses in New York City. Now they're up to, before the pandemic, right before, it was up to about 3.5%. But of course, black New Yorkers are almost a quarter of the population, so there's a huge gap there. So I'm curious from your perspective, having worked on this, but knowing that there's a lot more to do, what do we do next to preserve these gains? Where do we go from here to help ensure not only that the businesses that are in New York City today can survive, ride out these next few months and continue to, those who are hung on can stay in business, but how do we actually spark the next wave of small business creation in communities of color? What do we do? Yeah,
so great. I was nodding in terms of all the regulatory conversation and the entrepreneurship conversation, but I think, to your point, one of the things that I was striving to do when I was a commissioner was to position New York City as a welcoming city for black entrepreneurship. We are losing that war. Atlanta is seen as the mecca for black entrepreneurs. But there's a reason for that, right? There's an ecosystem in Atlanta. And for us to compete with that, we have to create more black millionaires. It's simple as that. Maynard Jackson, and the way you do that, and I'm no longer in government, I could say this. The next administration needs to find a corp council that is not conservative, that will look at how we do things in New York City. And instead of saying, like, we are going to get sued, let's just say, so what? Let them sue us, let's figure out how to actually do this program, right? So we have to be aggressive in terms of how we create wealth. And the reason why I say that, Maynard Jackson created wealth by creating set-aside programs in Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport that created a whole bunch of millionaires. This is back in the 70s and the 80s. Those millionaires are now serving as investors to the next generation of entrepreneurs, right? So we in New York City, we have an ecosystem here. We have the ability to create black millionaires. We have a MWU program, and I will give this administration credit. During the Bloomberg administration, when Bloomberg left, we were at 8% utilization. We're now at almost 30%. But it took changing laws and being more creative. But we could do a lot more in terms of looking at our city's procurement and figuring out how we can actually create wealth through our city's procurement. Secondarily, we need to figure out how to address the access to capital. access to capital is a challenge for a number of businesses, but particularly in minority and women-owned businesses, it is one of those situations. And the work that I'm doing with the Social Justice Fund, in terms of innovation, one of the things, we just created a program, a loan program for BIPOC entrepreneurs, only in Brooklyn. But what we are doing is we're not asking for guarantors and we're not asking for collateral. What we're asking for is, whether you're viable and a character assessment, right? That's the innovation we need to see coming from government, but it can't just come from government, to your point, industry. So we need a mayor that will sit down with all the major banks who we actually park our $90 billion in and say, what can we do to lend more to our small businesses, our minority businesses. So those are the things, those are just briefly some of the things. The other thing, and I agree with you, is affordable space. For those who don't know, if you are interested in this topic, we commissioned a report. It's called BNYC. There's a report out there. You can see, we spoke to so many Black entrepreneurs. They told us what they need. Affordable space is one of those things. So certainly, working with EDC, working with the city's assets, we could figure out a way to create affordable space, even with the private sector. One of the things I've seen in Brooklyn, for example, there's a great company called Brooklyn Circus. They are in Brooklyn Heights. And the reason why they're able to afford that space is because back in the 80s, the city sold the property to, I think it's Fifth Avenue Committee. And Fifth Avenue Committee owns a number of properties in that area. And when you look at the businesses that's operating in those space, they are more progressive in terms of offering, whether it's, paid sick leave, et cetera, because Fifth Avenue Committee has the rent below market. So the city could figure out all these empty storefronts that I know, well, I don't see it, all the empty storefronts out there, and figure out, what can we do to put together some type of initiative where the city owns those storefronts, and then we could create space for artists, space for new entrepreneurs. We have to be creative. And the last thing I would say is our regulatory environment. And the regulatory environment has been the Achilles heel for all of us. I think, and when I say all of us, all our administrations, Bloomberg, even de Blasio, we've tried to figure out how to make this thing easy. I will tell you, the only reason why we have all these regulations is because somebody was doing something bad, right? That's the unfortunate thing. But we have to figure out how to not make it so hostile to small businesses. And literally part of that solution, and this is not something people talk about, it is not something a mayor runs on, is the technology back end, right? When an agency has a file from one business, the fire department is not talking to the buildings department is not talking to the health department is not talking to landmarks because of the technology infrastructure. And we as government, we're not good at implementing technology solutions. So unfortunately, I think the next administration is going to have to get creative to figure out how we can actually bring transparency on the technology side to make it easier for businesses to operate.
Thanks, Greg. I think I saw Lizette's hand, and then David.
I think there's definitely, I would say, the role and importance of intermediaries that need to be there to negotiate across the sectors, right? So, for example, I come from the workforce place, from building a workforce organization, researching and funding it, right? And so in building it, one thing I realized with the 26 firms we partnered with on Wall Street was just even getting a payment structure to young people was hard. We paid the stipend. We paid for the liability insurance. We did the training. We did those pieces. And then all of a sudden, partners lined up, right? But that happens through a key intermediary, and I would say a sector of New York that rivals anywhere else in the country. It's our independent sector, our nonprofit sector.
Yeah, that's right.
When we look at that, what is the kind of infusion and support we can do there? If we say that companies have an issue with accessing funds, well, we have to work on contracting to make sure that our nonprofits are able to receive funds to be as nimble as they are quickly. That's an important one. The other part I think that's key about nonprofits is that we design the infrastructure for the care economy that is necessary to fuel the talent that is in these other parts of the economy. And so we are very sophisticated in that way. And I think the other thing that's missing is you'll look at, everybody knows about McKinsey Scott giving money and things like that. Look at disproportionately, it's coming to New York. These are nonprofits that are making decisions around expansion and levels of infusion of funds that they've not seen before, that it's part of building this economy as well, too. And I think we can't ignore how sophisticated it is in New York for that reason. So I want to make sure that for whoever the new mayor is, that is a central part of how we think about rebuilding this. And I guess I'll end with this. It is through nonprofits particularly. We have seen career paths that go to and through college, those relationships, right? So when we're talking about pre-existing talent that we want to build pipelines through, we have an incredible asset here. It also needs the attention.
Thanks, Suzette. And I think to underscore that point, and what Winston mentioned earlier, Center for Urban Future, we are huge believers in the power of CUNY as an engine of economic mobility. But when it comes to work-based learning, the CUNY's own data shows that only about 1 in 7 CUNY students ever has a paid internship by the time they graduate. And so just to your point, Winston, that needs to change. Let me ask, David had his hand up, and then I've got a question for everybody as well.
Sort of half a hand.
Half a hand.
In the non-for-profit world, following Dine Out, we had someone who was willing to give us $1 million worth of equipment they weren't using. Someone who wanted to get this equipment into performance groups in all 5 boroughs. And through the fund and through a number of groups, but it was a difficult thing to say, how do you activate that? How do you make it legal? How do you give that to people? And in that case, it was going to specific groups like Bronx Academy of Art and Design and the city's Open Stages program, that by having ownership by those groups and the fact that it wasn't permanent. And I do wonder whether one of the things going forward to think about, you mentioned storefronts, and there's a lot of heat around storefront installations, but I wonder whether what's going to emerge is something in between pop-up and permanent, that is shorter-term leases that allows landlords to take unused space, not just on the ground floor, and find a way that the city can support using those so the landlords aren't getting up a 15-year lease that they're worried about, but they're using it as jumpstart programs. And I do think private-public partnerships are things that people in my world are afraid to jump into, when in fact you can make a very big difference by doing that. We were lucky enough with Dine Out to get to the Hospitality Alliance in Melba Wilson, and outdoor dining was not going to be allowed, and we went to 6 all restaurateurs, all people of color that owned these 6 restaurants, and it was an initial pilot program that led to other things. But it takes, and it was a lot of cutting through of regulations. So I don't know how you make that clear that people can do that, make that invitation clearer, and make it less onerous.
Can I just build on one thing, David, that you were saying, and go back to a program that may be an illustration of how you can do some of the things that you're describing that we did after 2008, which was that, similar to now, although different, there was a lot of vacant space. And then as now, we really felt that entrepreneurship was an important part of the formula for bringing New York's economy back. And so what EDC did and the administration did was we went out to landlords and we said, tell us if you have vacant space and allow us to enter into a medium-term agreement to take that space. We then went out and we found mission-driven organizations, not-for-profits, whether they were universities or groups that worked in job training and skills building, and we had them manage the spaces. We gave them a relatively modest stipend from the city government to cover their costs, and it turns out that these things you could do for $100,000 each or something like that. Then they managed the space. They curated the selection of the people. They gave them the skills building and the education and the training that they needed. They helped connect them to capital. And the benefit to the landlords was not just that they had activity in their buildings, but also that, at least in theory, if these businesses became successful, they would be more likely to want to stay in proximate space and grow in that proximate space. And by the end of the administration, I think we had 14 or 15 of these with, I think it was 400 or 500 different businesses in them. And that's certainly an example of something that you could do at relatively low cost that brings the public together with the private, that helps solve a problem and take advantage of an issue that we have with space today, and also helps to grow the businesses of the future.
Well, Winston, I mean, I see you itching because I know this is your bread and butter.
It's when we speak about vacant retail, and that's a perfect example, the challenge there is there's actually not something you can tell a landlord to do, because a landlord would actually rent space if there was somebody to rent space. There's some people who have higher price they want to charge, but given the vast amount of vacancy, it's actually government, I think, can provide a construct for multiple ways of success that can go in that space. That is access to capital. That's actually providing credit support for ideas to flourish in there, right? And because, by the way, there's the whole the complexity of this is somebody will say, well, I don't want to lease to this person because they're not a good bet. And then I'm on the hook to the bank. So I actually think government cannot actually solve, you can't say exactly how to solve the problem. You can provide a framework for, so to speak, the private sector to flourish. And then we get into the ideas of working with CUNY, where there could be some great ideas, working with the arts, access to capital is a massive problem, as well as early child care. So provide that construct and let the private market flourish. You can't say what it is.
Well, I'd like to come back to this point about thinking about retail and commercial vacancy. But Sheena, I want to bring you into this conversation. I think on this point about wealth creation, wealth building. I think several panelists, Gregg, Lizette, you've brought up the idea that building wealth in communities of color, it's not just an equity issue. It really could be an economic development imperative. This is how you can help to generate more business growth and more hiring in communities of color. But it's no easy feat. So I'm curious, Sheena, from where you're sitting, what should come next in terms of government support to build community wealth in communities that have not only suffered disproportionately from the pandemic, but faced, decades and generations of disinvestment? What are one or two specific things that you think should happen next?
Well, I think so much of what has been said, I'm just like, this is a choir here, we're all on the hymnal. But doing all of that just very intentionally focused on equity, right? So focused on the neighborhoods and the communities that have been hardest hit by COVID. Focus on those industries that you mentioned at the top of this talk that have been most impacted, right? All of the, you talk about the nail salons and the other kinds of stores that mostly people of color in those communities are focused on, and doing all of these things. So, one example is, in COVID at United Way of New York City, as an intermediary, because you do need not just government to provide a framework and then business, kind of figure it out within a framework, but people to really come together at the table as equal partners with an intermediary that often kind of fills in the gap. So one of the things that we were called into service to do, really in response to Black entrepreneurs, so before COVID-19 hit, you said 3% of the businesses in the city of New York were Black-owned, which I think is just an atrocity. I mean, and it's something we should all be just ashamed of, quite frankly. And what we were facing was an extinction level event. That we could actually wake up in however many months and have a city that really basically had less than 1% of Black-owned businesses. And those entrepreneurs were calling us, Melbuzz and others, to say, you're the United Way, like you're, and in a crisis, right, it is those nonprofits that are on the front lines that are first in service and need. So we drew on the great work that SBS had done for the Black, BENYC Black entrepreneurs. We listened to those communities, right? That's the first thing. Often, they have the solutions. They know exactly what they need. And we drew on that data, we connected with people, and we actually stood up an initiative called Together We Thrive, which was absolutely about access to capital, but access to capital that had to be structured to meet the needs of these particular entrepreneurs, right? So Winston talked about credit enhancements. Oh, there's so many barriers that, will prevent people from getting that capital. So you have to really, the product has to meet the customer's needs. So that's one. The other thing that they needed was real technical assistance and capacity building. So, I mean, they had to re-envision their business like every 5 minutes, right? Are we online? Are we open? Are we closed? How do we deal with the regulations, et cetera? And that in and of itself was a full-time job. So we sourced volunteers from the corporate sector, whether they were in finance or, marketing, to really work, hand in glove with these businesses to help them get online, look at their books, prepare their loan application. So that, again, is like, how do you bring the private sector in? Space, right? Well, we were shut down, but that continues to be an issue. And they really wanted to be in community. They wanted to be, that's why when you think about some of these kind of venture capital like ecosystems where people can share and leverage, right? They said, we have common expenses. How do we pool them and get a lower cost? So all of those things. And so, we've served hundreds of businesses. We need more of that. We need to scale that. There needs to be kind of more capital that meets the needs, more technical assistance capacity building, more of, access to all of the things that they say they need. And if you really listen to communities and you are responsive to what they say they need, you can really solve problems at scale. And so that's part of what I think is going to be critically important, being very intentional, being very focused, and really understanding that you've got to diagnose before you design something and really make sure you have all the relevant stakeholders at the table.
Sure. I got Seth's hand up, then go to Lizette, and then to Winston.
Yes, it's a real quick one, but I think this is, when we think about BIPOC-led businesses, particularly Black-owned businesses, I think in the arts, that's where the fund actually had a role too in supporting BIPOC-led arts organizations, which are also extremely vulnerable as well too. So when we talk about arts and bringing the arts back, who are the ones who have the least IP, as we say, in the art space, and that we could provide support for? So I would say that looking at what Sheena's saying, how do we expand that to make sure arts-led, BIPOC-led organizations in the arts also get the support?
That's absolutely right, Lizette. I'll just say, for those who are interested, we have a report on CUF's website, a recent study called Creative Comeback, where one of the alarming things we found was that 1/4 of the BIPOC-led arts organizations in the city lost access to their only physical space during the pandemic. So, Greg, I think, first of all, I saw Seth's hand up.
No, you go ahead, Greg.
No, I was going to, just really quick as an example of why we need the next administration to be innovative. When you look at commercial corridors across the city, there's the ground floor retail, but then you've got the second floor. These are usually 2 or 3 floor buildings, but the top floor is usually vacant. And the cost to that landlord to actually activate that second floor space, just think about downtown Brooklyn, Fulton Mall, is prohibitive. And just getting the Department of Buildings to work with that landlord. So figuring out a way, similar to what Seth was talking about, where you could figure out a way to make that process easier, activate those the second floor space. Now you have space for the arts. You have space for even other types of businesses. So those are like some specific ways, but it has to come from the top in terms of like the next mayor needs to say, this is important for me, because the agencies are too busy doing what they're supposed to do and they're not collaborating. So the mayor has to set that tone. The first deputy mayor has to set that tone. And then we definitely need to have a deputy mayor of economic development who's laser focused on making sure these things happen.
Thanks, Greg. So I got Seth, Winston, and David as well. I'd love to hear from all three of you.
I just wanted to underline something that Sheena was saying and to make sure that a point is made explicitly that I think she was making implicitly, which is that when government especially looks to get involved in problems like this, that the process is as important as the intention. Yeah. And it's very easy to get up at a lectern and say that we're going to solve this problem, we're going to solve that problem. But if you're not really thoughtful about how you go about doing it, you're not going to succeed. And in fact, I think in many ways the cynicism that a lot of people feel about government is exactly for that reason. You have people promising that they're going to solve every problem in the world, and then nothing gets solved, and people just give up. And 2 things I think that Sheena said are really important. One is taking entrepreneurship as an example. The solution can't be piecemeal. It has to be comprehensive. The needs of entrepreneurs that we've talked about, and there are more than these, but it's skills, it's space, it's capital. And if you solve one of those problems, but you don't solve the others, you're not really solving the overall problem. And then the second thing that I would say, and you had mentioned this, and I forgot to answer your question, but I also think that there's a way that you go about figuring out what the problem is and then putting solutions in place. And again, I think what the tendency in government is to want to have the mayor stand up, and this is true of all mayors, and say, I'm going to solve the problem, it's a $300 million program, and tomorrow everything's going to be better than it's ever been before. But that's not really how problems get solved. You have to start by doing exactly what Sheena said and analyzing what the problem is. People love to throw out answers, but actually framing the questions is an important part of the process. And then once you've done that, which involves analysis, it involves, as Sheena said, listening, that's a very important part of it, then you start to formulate what you think are solutions. But in many cases, what you think are the solutions will turn out not actually to be the solutions. And so I've found that doing a lot of little pilot programs that test different theories and seeing what actually works and what doesn't work, and then killing the things that don't work and doubling down on the things that do is probably the most effective way of actually solving problems at scale. And so again, while it's not as glamorous for the mayor to get up and say, I'm going to do 10 $100,000 pilots, at the end of the day, if you really want to solve the problems, that's the best way to do it. And I think with all of the problems that we're talking about, we have to make sure that the next administration adopts an approach like that and resists the temptation to try to act as if waving a magic wand is going to be the be-all and end-all for us.
Winston.
Thank you. Two things is, one, I actually think much of this rests with the Economic Development Office of New York City and New York State. It's actually not what, right, it's the state. And I really am hopeful that we have turned a new corner. I really do believe there's going to be much greater coordination between the two agencies. But at the end of the day, there are great ideas. We need a world-class economic development offices that talk to each other and work together. I think we were talking about Atlanta as the center of Black entrepreneurship. I've been down to that economic development office. It's impressive. And they roll out the red carpet. City and state are there. They have a whole presentation on the city of Atlanta. I mean, they make you feel welcome, and they'll tell you every program, and they follow up with you. What can we do to get you there? We don't do that.
That's right.
We don't. And so if we actually want to have access to credit, you actually have to start with a clear, concise message with both organizations working together and providing easy to access information. Everything else is going to be very challenged if you don't have that. The last point is, and this is going to be very hard for New York, we need to do less because we want to do everything. Actually choose the things. So access to credit and child care, two major initiatives. If you solved those two problems, what would that do for New York? It would be amazing. I know there's other stuff, but just we can't do everything actually. So let's do some things that will be the most impactful, cut through the red tape, prioritize, and actually get exceptional success. That will go a long way.
Thanks, Winston. David, do you want to jump in?
Well, it's a jump in scale, a jump down in scale, but one of the things I was inspired by listening to the ideas about how complicated it is to do anything is thinking about the creation of expedited process that gets the building department, the fire department, landmarks to allow projects. It's one of the things that happened during COVID by necessity. And I think we need to hold on to trying to make that available, really design that process so that it's not impossible to get something done. And just one small way to think about that is there's a lot of interesting uses that could share smaller public spaces in New York. You know, outdoor dining was never meant to last forever, so the structures aren't built to do that. They need to be demountable. There's a complicated future. But it has opened up the idea that thinking about the liveness of New York, the electricity of liveness, which drives people, taking that space between private and public and thinking about how that's available to the arts, how that's available for a number of people, I think enlivens a street and creates a path forward, an easy path forward sort of entry for a whole group of artists who want to come to the city.
Thanks, David. Well, let me take that moment to then sort of pivot a little bit into, I think, this equally important part of the conversation around specific ideas to drive an equitable and inclusive recovery. And we've already touched on this, more than touched on it, developed some ideas here. But the stakes are really high. I mean, we're really facing right now a recovery that is as other economists have put it, K-shaped. We're seeing in New York City that folks that have had office jobs have been, gotten through this relatively unscathed, and folks that are either in frontline work where they've been exposed to the health risks of the virus have borne the brunt of the health effects, or have lost their jobs because they're working in accessible industries like the tourism economy. So to do something about this obviously requires more even than just bringing back the enormous task of bringing back nearly 500,000 jobs, but really building much stronger pathways into the good jobs, the jobs that are poised to really continue to grow and drive the city's economy. So how do we do this? And more specifically, what are very specific ideas for the next mayoral administration, this incoming class of city council members, folks who I think, and I would say this, I think the good news here is that I think there's a near universal agreement that this is the need right now, that we're in an era that demands this kind of accountability to equity. We hear this from everyone that's running for office and is going to be taking office in 2021, but obviously it's much easier said than done. So, I'd like to ask everybody in general, what are some specific things that should be done first and done now to help make sure that this economic recovery doesn't leave low-income New Yorkers even further behind? And I think we can get into higher education and work-based learning and workforce development across the board, but Lizette, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I would think one of the first things, you think about the low-hanging fruit, as you say, in some ways, I would triple the summer youth employment program. And the reason why I say that is that so often, we got some, all right. And, and then, but I think that some of it is also, yes, we're all for that, but some of it is how do we make sure that at least a third of those are also in the private sector, right? So that we really are exposing young people to that. And I think one thing that happens is we forget early exposure, right, prevents chronic long-term unemployment, right? We know these links that happen, and yet we don't do the kind of investment we need to do. So I think that's one, right? And I think we got to figure out a way that CUNY can give credits while they're also doing that. Because guess what? Young people want both, right? They get it. And so I would say that would be one strategy, one thing that I think we could do that we have an infrastructure for already. I would say the second thing that's important is that we have to understand that the current talent in New York is not geographically anchored here as much anymore. And so I see great staff that are leaving, right? I don't care what sector you're in. They're leaving because, as we say, fill the spaces, bring them back. They're like, but why? Look, I could work with so-and-so in Silicon Valley who doesn't need to see me, and I could work. I'm just telling. So all of a sudden, in some ways that could be an up, but that can be a down too. So how do we think about remote workers in a way that also gives them a geographic enticement here? So we got to figure that out too. So I think there's ways to be creative around that, because I don't see the offices being filled tomorrow. I just don't.
Yeah, Greg, I'd love to go to this. And let me just add also, I mean, as somebody who ran the city's Department of Small Business Services, I'm curious, in addition to the broad ideas here, or some of the specifics, do you think there's something that the next commissioner of SBS should do differently? Would you like to change something about how this agency operates? You're absolutely unleashed to say what you want, but I'd love to. I'd love to get your thoughts.
So certainly, and Seth knows this. There needs to be tighter coordination in the economic development portfolio. Right. One of the biggest tragedies was SBS being moved out of the economic development portfolio. And so the next mayor needs to understand that structure. And certainly, I think, and I go, and folks may not understand why I'm harping on Corp Council, but really, a lot of the innovation dies in the law department. And I know there's some folks who deal with the law department in the past, but literally, SBS needs to be more innovative in terms of what I was thinking about was the Entrepreneurship Fund. If you look at the PPP, let's not look at the negative part of the PPP. Let's look at the positive part, which was government used an infrastructure to get money out to businesses to do specific things. So if government quickly. So if government through SBS, and SBS, there's some archaic rules and laws that SBS can't lend, et cetera. This is why I said Corp Council is definitely part of the solution here. Working closely with the EDC, figuring out how we can get an entrepreneurship fund in New York City to entice people to start businesses. Now, the sectors that we talked about are all service sectors. So you can imagine if somebody was in hospitality, if somebody was working at a restaurant, they have the experience to start their own restaurant. So why don't we incentivize them to do that, right? So having an entrepreneurship fund, being able to actually, whether you commit, $1 billion or, and that number sounds insane, but let's be real here. The NYPD's budget is $6 billion. SBS budget is $100 million. Where is our priority, right? We are obviously safety is important, but if people are working or if people are running a business, crime is solved, right? Because they're hiring within their communities. The young people have something to do. Whereas my first job was summer youth. My second job was the public library. I mean, like literally, if these small businesses are growing in our communities, then the NYPD's budget does not need to be $6 billion, right? So that's why we have to figure out how. Hopefully I don't, obviously I'm not looking for a position in the next administration, but it's like, but we have to figure out a way for us to actually prioritize the entrepreneurship and education. So SBS is key to that because they have a major investment in workforce and they also have a major investment in entrepreneurship. And EDC, working with SBS and also HPD, this is why you can't look at it in just one particular lane. Because when you think about HPD's role, well, we need more affordable housing, right? Because the reason why people are moving to Atlanta is because I could buy a house down there for $200,000 and actually get the support to run my business. So why would I stay in New York, right? So it has to be, that's why the economic development portfolio needs,
Less taxes.
and well, we'll talk about that. But like literally, the economic development portfolio is going to be key for the equitable recovery of New York City.
Well, let me ask Seth about this too, then, because I think looking for some advice for your future successor, the next person stepping into the role as the president of EDC, and I've heard I think two different arguments in the last few years. One is around EDC can't take its eye off the ball of its core mission to support economic growth. If we don't see that, if that one agency, which has it right there in the name, isn't laser focused on that, we're in trouble as a city when we're still short, hundreds of thousands of jobs, let alone good and accessible jobs. So. But at the same time, I think the argument has been building in recent years that, in fact, doing economic development without coupling that with workforce investments is the wrong way to do it, because you're not then able to make sure that growth benefits folks who've been left behind. I'm curious, from your perspective, having actually run the agency, first of all, how you look at that balancing those two sides of that debate, and maybe more importantly, what are one or two specific pieces of advice that you would give to your successor in that role to make sure they do a good job?
So I think that looking backwards, when I think about, as I mentioned before, what was done right earlier, recovering from previous crises, it was that we got the economic machine humming again, and we did it actually quickly, and we did it more effectively than other parts of the country. I think there was, though, an assumption that a rising tide would lift all boats. And I think what we found is that the way that the 21st century economy is structured, that in fact doesn't naturally happen. And that actually the opposite naturally happens. Wealth gets concentrated in a very few hands. And so I think that you can't take the lesson from that to be that you don't need a rising tide. You still need the rising tide. That is a necessary condition for widespread prosperity, but it's not a sufficient condition. And there's more that you have to do. And I guess the first thing I would say is, again, coming back to this process issue, I think that there are a ton of good ideas here. But if you look across the country, if you look around the world, nobody has actually figured out how to do this. And so I think that part of the answer is that we need to just keep trying new strategies, and we need to test ideas. And that's where these pilot programs that we can fund, test, and either expand or move on to the next idea are really important. The second thing I would say is part of this is just about goal setting. I think that when you're running a city agency, you tend to look at statistics citywide. And I think if the goals are set so that you're not just looking at citywide statistics, but you're also looking at how those citywide statistics translate into different demographic groups, into different neighborhoods, that allows you to view success or failure differently. And so I think making sure that we properly define the goals to include not just the macro but the micro as well is important. Then what I would also say is, and this is a theme that I think has been covered broadly on this conversation, but I think it's an important one, that we need to start thinking about the most critical tool and the most effective tool that we have to promote growth and equitable growth is skills building and training and education. And so we have to start thinking about that as part of the economic development formula. And then I guess the last thing that I would say, and in some ways maybe this is the least helpful and the hardest to achieve, but also I think is something that we're not spending enough time focusing on. In order, given the way that the 21st century economy is structured, and given the fact that if the economy were left to its own devices, wealth would be concentrated in a relatively small number of hands, the key player in ensuring more equitable growth is government. But for government to achieve that goal, government has to actually work. And the problem that we have in New York, and I would argue that this is true at the state level and the city level, is that government is not effective. We throw tons of money into our government programs. Our problem in New York is not a resource problem. We have a $100 billion city budget, and yet we're not achieving the outcomes that we need to achieve with that spending. And I think we have to stop thinking about government inefficiency as a victimless crime. It's not a victimless crime. When we throw money away, when we spend money ineffectively, that money is not going to solve the very real problems that we have. And so I think that's the last piece of this. And I think that until we make government output focused rather than just input focused, and hold government to the same standard that we each hold ourselves to, which is that it's not just what you're doing, but what you're doing actually results in, it's going to be very hard for us to solve that. But I think that we have the ability, and we have a moment in time now to make that change and to put those solutions into place. And so that would be, I guess, the sum total of my advice.
Thanks, Seth. Well, I'd like to ask everybody a follow-up question, actually. Maybe, Sheena, starting with you, based on Seth, what you were saying. And that's really about, you mentioned the power of pilot programs that really help to establish what can work. When we see that evidence supports it, then you can direct more resources there. I would argue from where I sit as a researcher at the Center for an Urban Future, we see too many good pilot initiatives in New York that don't get that follow-on investment. When I think about pathways into the tech sector, for example, our own research has shown that New York City is home to a number of really great tech training programs that consistently lead to good jobs in the tech sector and tech jobs in other industries. But those programs are serving from a few dozen to a few hundred people a year. We had Plinio Ayala, the CEO of Perscolas, up earlier. He mentioned they're going to train 700 New Yorkers over the next year, which is an incredible feat, but that's one of the largest programs in New York City of its kind. And you could say the same, I think, when it comes to access to capital or technical assistance for minority and immigrant-owned small businesses and on down the line. So here's my question for all of you. What is actually working? If you wanted to tell the next, the incoming administration, council members, again, who are looking for real solutions and, frankly, places to put that investment, what are some of the things, and I'd love to hear from all of you, where you'd say, this is actually something that's worthy of your investment, but it's still too small, it has room to grow. And Sheena, if you don't mind me putting on the spot, I'd love to start with you.
Wow, that could be a long list. And I think, your point is that there is so much innovation and effective and efficient programs and initiatives that are happening that are not getting the attention because sometimes people are like, well, I didn't think of it, or, there's a I think it was said earlier that, somebody wants to get up and declare that I've got the answer to the problem, and to really step back and have a little humility and say, you know what, let me actually scale what works as a focus and a priority would be a wonderful thing and something very necessary. But so many good things. I think that Together We Thrive is showing, demonstrated success. That's something that can potentially scale. But I just want to say one thing about what Seth said. I mean, it was, I think, so spot on. What gets measured gets done. And one of the reasons we have never had this equitable, inclusive, outcomes, because we haven't been focused on it or prioritized it or set it as a measure. And when and if we do that, and there's a level of accountability, and we have an operating model that can achieve that, that's when we can see progress. So that's critically important, to have the right population level goals that government and industry and nonprofits are really organized to achieve. So I think that's probably one of the most important things, having the right goals, and then making sure that we're all moving in the right direction.
I totally agree. I will tell you, we have the infrastructure. The mayor's office operations, measures, in agencies all the time. And as a commissioner, I sit down and look at our numbers, what we're measured on, and I worry about it, because then I have like a council member, like Councilmember Helen Rosenthal, who will, at a council hearing, will say, this number went down, right? So if it's not measured, then I'm not paying attention to it, right? So I totally agree with that. I think, in terms of to answer your question, SBS had and worked with a number of city agencies and industry, and I think Katie Galstig is somewhere around here, but she was in charge of the Office of Workforce Development, industry partnerships. Literally, we looked at the growing industries in New York City, and here's what we did. We sat down with the industry leaders and said, how can you employ more of our workers, right? And I will use the tech talent pipeline as an example. The tech sector said, well, the kids coming from CUNY don't have real world experience. And the CUNY president said, well, we don't have the resources to give them the real world experience. So government stepped in, and we gave CUNY, and let me tell you, it was actually very difficult to give CUNY $20 million. But we gave them $20 million to actually enhance their classrooms. And also, we worked with industry to bring in what we call, I would call them adjunct professors, but we can't really call them adjunct professors for union reasons. But anyway, like we brought in individuals who had that real world experience. So my point is that we have small numbers, right? But this is an area where we can blow it out in terms of bringing industry to the table. There are a lot of companies that want to come to New York City because of the workforce. We sit down with those companies. If you want an incentive to build a headquarters or whatever, well, here's a percentage of the population we would like for you to employ, right? These are the conversations that government can have with industry. And then we go to a Perscolis, or we go to a CUNY, and we say, this is the program and this is how we will ensure equitable recovery, by having that conversation, by being innovative, and certainly by looking at certain programs that we already have and just putting more resource in to actually expand.
Thanks, Craig. Is that, or anybody else want to jump in on this idea?
I'm going to jump in. I mean, I definitely, and supporting what I've heard, I do want to say there's some things that government does do well. I want to acknowledge that, Seth. I mean, the fact that we have clean water, I never take that for granted. I think about Flint, Michigan all the time, right? So, and there is someone that's responsible for making sure that happens, right? So I just want to, because there's a lot of challenges we have, but it's actually pretty amazing what gets done as well, too. I think we're just a highly complicated system as well, too, right? And that's what makes it so troublesome. I would say some of the things that I think that we could think about in a different way of solution that we could expand, or that we really have to understand that what are the listening tour of what are the barriers, and so often the intermediaries know what are the barriers on both sides when we're thinking about workforce development or economic development. And I think we just have to be more conscious of that and rolling that out. I think we have to think about what are intermediaries. Yes, the fund does this, but where funds can be distributed that can allow funding to happen, because it's true. I've seen some of the best negotiations stalled because they can't figure out how to get the money to someone. I mean, could you imagine? Could you imagine? This happens regularly, right? So that could be a fix, right? Because that could be done. I think the last thing is to think about, particularly how do we reimagine and think about how we talk about race and how we talk about gender and other inequity in a way that is measurable as an asset, not as a deficit, right? Because I think this is where the challenge is, right? Atlanta was unique in a few ways. One of it's welcoming. It's about creating and inspiring risk, not risk mitigation, which might be the SBS model, right? But look at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve in Atlanta wrote the article that said the markets structurally have racist implications, and they're hurting that, and black folks have been hurt by it. And this came from the Fed Reserve. Atlanta is seen as, even in the most conservative sectors in Atlanta, not all of Georgia, in Atlanta, as having a kind of conversation around race and implication for integration that New York doesn't have. all right? So when he says the Corp Council, I agree. I would love to see the Corp Council say, wow, yes, this is what happens when we concentrate, and what's our commitment to not do that? So those would be my suggestions.
Thanks, Suzette. Does anybody else want to jump in on things that they actually see working that could grow? And then I've got another question for everyone as well. But
It's a macro conversation, but we talk about Atlanta, and one of the things that really is so vibrant about Atlanta at the moment is the welcoming of the arts, culture and arts, diversity around culture and arts, and space, and the ability to get the work done. So you mentioned union, and I'm part of several unions, but they make it easy for that to happen. It's porous. And one thing that I think works in New York to point to is a macro piece, as I went to Shakespeare in the Park the other day and was reminded about their public works program, which takes community members from all over the city, and it's a kind of miraculous thing that they do. And when you think about education and skills building and apprenticeship, the theater world is largely difficult to get into. It's hard to figure out an entry ramp. It's hard to figure out what those jobs are. And we're in a city where if you could match that kind of program to apprenticeship, you've got all the professionals working here. So I think there could be some real learnings from what they're doing, what's happening in Atlanta, and have the arts become more extroverted and be more welcoming and more visible and not insular into buildings that cost a huge amount of money to get into.
that's a great point, David. And there's just another data point to support that. There is one such program that I'm aware of in New York City right now that's operated by the Roundabout Theater Company. It's a nonprofit theater. Yeah. But their total capacity for their really excellent in-depth training program for theater technicians and theater professionals is about 10 people a year, something like that. So, just to give you a sense of the scale of the missed opportunity there. And they're a nonprofit with its own mission, but they're doing this anyway.
If you encourage productions to and required some level of apprenticeship, that would be exponential and quickly.
I think it's a great idea. Winston, bring it back in.
David stole my thunder almost exactly right, is apprenticeships.
That's not possible. So much fun.
Thank you.
Keep roaring on that one.
I think apprenticeships are a very powerful tool that are not used at all. I mean, they're not in the United States on any scale. And if you look at Manchester, England, you look at Switzerland, they have apprenticeship programs that go to finance, go to the arts, go to tech. It's not just, and by the way, this is a great career path too, to be a plumber, but meaning it's across all sectors. And New York could lead the nation and set a standard for what does apprenticeships look like. And one of the ways I would say you ask about policy is tax policy. Much of what taxes can encourage or discourage behavior. If we want to see programs get funded and we want to see things happen quickly, use taxes to get there. Encourage behavior from the private sector to get there. It's not just create another program. It's actually creating a construct for the programs to work. And so I would highly encourage the next government to look at tax policy as a way to encourage behavior or outcomes that we're looking for in New York, because we have great programs. We actually almost don't need another one. You said it. Are they funded? Are they there? So think about how we actually work with what we have and encourage that funding. I think we'd see a lot more success than another program being invented.
Yeah, and it's a great point about apprenticeships. I mean, you could look at lots of Cuff research on this, but there are fewer than 100 registered apprenticeship programs in New York City, which is really alarming. And about 90% of those programs are in the building trades or manufacturing. And as you said, those are great jobs. Those are important career pathways. But there's a lot more in New York City's economy, and we haven't built programs for that.
But that, what I would say, is that's also a state negotiation. What does it mean to have to be a registered apprenticeship? There are thousands of incredible workforce programs as far as having participants that are not registered apprenticeships because it's so difficult to be. So I just want to add that there is that piece too.
And there are design schools in many other places that are much more proactive about getting apprentices than there are in New York. I think if you just want to take that one microcosm, there's a lot of room to grow.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, Seth, go ahead.
I want to just give two additional thoughts, one of which I've been debating saying, and the other which I think is pretty straightforward. But the straightforward one, I think, is another thing that we do that we should be doing more of, and that there may in fact be an opportunity to do more of because of what's happening at the federal government, is investing in infrastructure, which is, another thing that we didn't do well the last time around, was that while the flywheel was turning and the economy was growing, we weren't able to build enough supply of anything to match the demand, and that included infrastructure, and we saw what was happening as a result of that. So there's an economic growth reason to invest in infrastructure, and in addition to that, it's a great way to spread the benefits because you impact people and workers with all different levels of skills, and generally at pretty highly paying rates. So that would be one thing. The more controversial thing I was going to say is in direct response to your question of what is working that we could do more of, and just listen to why I'm saying this before you react, is I think another thing to think about is CompStat, which the police department uses to measure its performance. And the reason I'm saying that is not necessarily because the goals of the police department are right or wrong. I won't get into that discussion. But they have a system whereby they set goals, they measure and in real time how they're performing against those goals, and then they hold people accountable if they don't meet those goals. And that's a system which, if matched with the right goals, could be extremely powerful and could be spread across all agencies in the city. So that would be another answer that I would give.
Thank you, Seth. Well, let me actually ask something that's sort of related to infrastructure, and I think, David, it's a question I want to turn to you on, which is really about one of the great bright spots in this really dark time, which is the rethinking of public space. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. We know that Justin Garrett Moore had a great idea about strengthening the ability of communities to take care of public spaces, to program them, to maintain them. I'm wondering, and obviously you helped to lead the charge at your firm to not only create systems for restaurants to be able to use, to take advantage of outdoor dining, but also for open culture, to help arts and cultural organizations actually get out into public space. So without even just looking back at how the last 18 months have gone, what's next? I mean, if there's generally agreement that re-envisioning public space has been one of the true bright spots in this pandemic, where should we go from here? What's the next step, or how do we get there to be able to take better advantage of public space in ways that we've learned is possible over the past year?
One of the things I'd love to see as the next step is more overt invitation and opportunity for public-private partnerships. Because early on in Dine Out, when we started to work with DOT, we approached other architects, other designers, other people who had resources, maybe other than cash, who really wanted to help. And it seemed difficult and challenging. And I think if the path forward were made clearer, you'd get a lot more people participating. And maybe it's really matching. It's a little bit, one of the amazing public-private partnerships is New York Restoration Project, the thing Bette Midler started, where they have people from the private sector adopting public spaces and then really get those communities maintaining them. So I think breaking down the scale of the city to be more community-based, activating those communities to look at the public spaces, and not just the large parks, but I do think there's a really interesting conversation about streets and how we share the streets. And so I think making it a more overt opportunity and focusing on developing those private partnerships, I think going to having lots of pilot programs would yield huge benefits.
I know we're short on time, but I love the infrastructure and the open space conversation, because I think the next mayor needs to. I know in Brooklyn we have this. I don't know if it's still going to move forward, but there was an idea of building a light rail from Sunset Park all the way to connect to Queens. And I think what we have done poorly in New York City is try to make our streets inclusive for everyone. We just can't, right? So we have to admit that we're going to have to shut down some streets. We're going to have to, again, we put a bike lane on the Brooklyn Bridge, right? Like, why didn't we think about just building another bridge for pedestrians and bikes, right? Like, we can't do everything in our infrastructure, so we have to create either new infrastructure, but we also have to be innovative and figure out different modules of transportation that we have not thought about, right? And I love the MTA, but it doesn't literally go to certain communities in Queens, in South Brooklyn, in Red Hook, in Staten Island, right? There's no connectivity, right? So we need to figure out how to actually use infrastructure to also improve on transportation and also figure out like our open streets and literally make it easier for New York City, for New York residents to actually enjoy our city.
And if I can just say, and this, we can have a whole different panel about this, but talking about infrastructure, this again comes back to making government work.
Right.
The reason why we can't build a new bridge is because it's cost prohibitive to do that, and the regulations are impossible to overcome in New York. And we have to address that. I think the statistic that I read, and I know that the Center for an Urban Future has done its own reports on this, but that it costs something like 4 or 5 times as much per mile to build a subway in New York as it does not in Shanghai or Beijing, but in Paris or Tokyo. Right. And if it just cost us what it costs in Paris or Tokyo to build a subway, with the money that we spent on 3 stations in the Second Avenue subway, we would have had an entirely new Second Avenue subway from the north of Manhattan to the south. So we have to figure out how to do that better.
Thank you, Seth. On that note, as we launch into our next panel discussion about infrastructure, I want to just say thank you all so much. If everyone could join me in a round of applause for our amazing panelists. It's a terrific conversation.